This is the little 12th century church, Norse church of St Magnus, the patron saint of Orkney. Magnus was the eldest son of the Earl Erland, whilst his cousin, Hakon, was the son of Earl Paul. The two earls were unseated by the Norwegian king Magnus Barelegs, who made his son Sigurd overlord of the Orkneys. Magnus Erlandsson was brought up in Birsey and probably educated by monks on the Broch. A monastic site completed in the 12th century can still be seen there. King Magnus took Hakon and the 18-year-old Magnus on a raiding expedition down the west coast of Scotland, travelling as far south as Egilsay. The king sailed down the Menai Strait, spoiling for a fight. "Prepare your weapons, Magnus." Says Magnus, "It's not right. I have no quarrel with these men, no cause to see them dead. My faith prevents me fighting them. I'll sing the psalms instead." "It's not your faith, you're gutless, so hide below the hatch." But Magnus stayed there on the deck and never got a scratch. The king would not forgive him, so Magnus had to hide and stayed away from Orkney until the king had died. He learned to listen to wise men, he read about the law, he handed even justice alike to rich and poor. This monument marks the spot where it was traditionally said that St Magnus was martyred, and the story is told in the Orkney Inga saga. Magnus was joint ruler with his cousin Hakon of Orkney, but men of evil disposition began stirring trouble, and Hakon, says the saga, was jealous of Magnus's popularity and was therefore more disposed to listen to these miserable men. Whatever their motives, the agitators succeeded in creating enmity between Magnus and Hakon, so much so that they drew up for a battle at a thing, an assembly, on the Orkney mainland. The site of this meeting has been suggested as being Tingwall, meaning assembly field, in the mainland parish of Rendell. But a battle was averted. Neutral parties managed to persuade the two earls to make peace. A further meeting was arranged to finalise this treaty, with the earls to meet on Egilsay at Easter, each bringing only 2 ships and an equal number of men. At the allotted time, and with the agreed number of men, Magnus set out for Egilsay. Approaching the island in calm water, says the saga, a great wave rose up and struck Magnus's ship. This, it recounts, was taken to be an omen of the earl's death. "No wonder that you were surprised by this," said Magnus to his men. "Indeed, I take this as a foreboding of my death." Magnus was the first to arrive on Egilsay, where he waited for the arrival of his cousin. When, later that day, 8 warships came into view, it became clear that treachery was afoot. Hakon and his men landed on Egilsay the following morning. After first ransacking the church, Hakon sought out Magnus, who had gone to another part of the island to a certain hiding place. After a search, Magnus was found, captured, and brought before an assembly of local chieftains. There, the saga stresses Magnus was concerned only for the welfare of his deceitful cousin's immortal soul. Magnus made 3 suggestions that would save Hakon from breaking his oath by killing an unarmed man. The first, that Magnus would go on a pilgrimage and never return to Orkney, was rejected, as was the second, that Magnus be exiled to Scotland and imprisoned. The final suggestion was that Hakon should have me mutilated in any way you choose, rather than take my life, or else blind me and lock me in a dungeon. Hakon deemed this acceptable, but the assembly were not so keen. The chieftains leapt to their feet and announced that one of the earls had to die. They had had their fill of joint rule in Orkney. Hakon smugly informed the dissenters that, as he preferred ruling and was not ready to die, Magnus should be slain. Magnus put forward no argument, so was doomed to death. Informing his followers they were not to die defending him, Magnus stepped forward to accept his fate. With Magnus's fate sealed, Hakon ordered Offaig, his standard-bearer, to execute the earl, but the warrior refused angrily. Enraged, Hakon turned to his cook, Lifolf, and instructed him to kill Magnus. According to the saga, Lifold wept loudly, but Magnus spoke comforting words and forgave him for the acts he must carry out. "Be not afraid, for you do this against your will, and he who forces you sins more than you do." So Magnus knelt before Lifolf and asked to be struck hard on the head, rather than beheaded like a common criminal. "Stand thou before me and hew on my head a great wound, for it is not seemly to behead chiefs like thieves. Take heart, poor wretch, for I have prayed to God for thee, that he be merciful unto thee." Lifolf struck the blow and cleaved the earl's skull in two. Magnus was killed on April the 16th, 1117. Magnus was denied a Christian burial by Earl Hakon and simply buried where he fell. But shortly afterwards the miracles started to happen. And the Orkney saga recounts that the site of Magnus's murder was originally rocky and overgrown, but after his death God showed that he had suffered for righteousness' sake, and the area was miraculously transformed into a green field. Magnus's mother, Thora, pleaded with Hakon to allow her son a Christian burial. Hakon relented and allowed Magnus's corpse to be retrieved. Soon after his martyrdom, Earl Magnus's body was carried to mainland and buried at Christchurch, which Earl Thorfinn had built. Not long after the burial, a bright heavenly light was often seen over Magnus's grave. Then people in peril started praying to him, and no sooner did they pray than their troubles came to an end. Miracles were said to have happened at the tomb of Magnus, but Bishop William refused to accept his sanctity and discouraged the pilgrims who gathered there. One day, while at prayer in the kirk, Bishop William went blind. His sight was restored after he prayed at the tomb of Magnus and vowed to have him made a saint. The bones of St Magnus were later removed to St Olaf's Kirk in Kirkwall, after Magnus had appeared in a dream to a West Ray man called Gunny and ordered it. St Magnus's Cathedral would be founded in 1137 to house his bones, where they remain to this day. We are looking across to St Magnus's Cathedral. We're standing in the Musi Tower of the Earl's Palace, and the cathedral was started in the 1100s and took several hundred years to build. And in fact the steeple was added in 1920. The original cathedral was expanded after Magnus's nephew Rognvald was declared a saint in 1192 and enlarged again in the 1400s.
Nobilis, humilis, magnevatis habilis, habilis, utilis, comes venerabilis, et tutor laudabilis, tuos subditos. Serva canis fragilis, vole positos. Turbidus, invidus, hostis haco calidus, sternere, tenere, tua sibi subtere, Iuncto fraudis sedere, pacis osculo. Preditus, celitus, dono sancti spiritus, vivere, temere, sumo caves opere, carnis motus premere, studes penitus.
In March 1919, a wooden box containing a skull and bones was found during extensive renovation work in St Magnus Cathedral. The skull, which showed clear signs of injury, was heralded as that of St Magnus. The experts who examined the remains in 1925, Professor Reid of Aberdeen University and the Reverend Dr. George Walker of Aberdeen's East Parish Church, were left in no doubt as to the identity. Those acquainted with the circumstances of the murder of St Magnus could have little hesitation in believing that the skull bore the veritable mark of his death wound, and that these were the relics of the saint, said Dr. Walker, before adding that the examinations entirely proved the identification. The bones were later reinterred in St Magnus Cathedral, where they remain today.